When we speak of American literature expanding into the literary canon, it largely begins with what was written in the pre-colonial era, basically from Columbus's discovery of America and onwards. Thus, discovery narratives were among the first literary works to be recognized as American literature, such as Alva Nunez Cabeza de Vaca's Letter to Spanish Royalty, in which he describes the land he found, the natives he interacted with, and the great difficulties he and his men experienced, being lost, being hungry, etc., in their travels, which is an example of a Jeremiad, or in other words, a story of difficulty and woe. Getting into the colonial era, we start to get the idea called American exceptionalism, believing that America is special and has some great destiny. John Smith's discovery narrative promoted this idea of America as the new frontier for economic gain, and also the beginnings of the American dream. Also, the discovery narratives of William Bradford in 1620, who led the Pilgrims of Plymouth, and of John Winthrop in 1630, who led the Puritans of Boston, also promoted American exceptionalism by talking about America's destiny as the new frontier of Protestant Christianity. All of this religious emphasis led up to the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson, who compares her situation to that of biblical figures, also known as typology, and reflects the Calvinist influence of the period. Religious focus continues, even producing the 1740 Great Awakening and Cotton Mather's Wonders of the Invisible World. As the American colonies expanded and the Enlightenment period took hold, Enlightenment as in a Western revolution in science, philosophy, society, and politics, the topics of race, gender, and class began to get heated. This brought about the writings of Thomas Paine, for example, Common Sense, debating why America should separate herself from Britain, and eventually the American Revolution in 1776. American neoclassicism, Western cultures drawing inspiration from Greece and Rome, influenced the autobiography of Ben Franklin, the formation of the American Republican government, and all this talk of our freedom and American exceptionalism growing into nationalism gave rise to the slave narrative, the slave stories of Olaudah Equiano and the black female poet Phillis Wheatley. Now for Romanticism and Realism. You've heard of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Edgar Allan Poe, Hawthorne, Thoreau, and Emily Dickinson, right? Of course you have. That's because these writers and more featured in the American Renaissance that stretched from about 1820 to 1865. And to quote the Norton Anthology of American Literature, they were central to our understanding of American literary tradition from the 19th century to the present day. Many of these writers were transcendentalists, which is like the American version of Europe's Romanticism, a focus on individualism, including the rising trend in autobiographies and Emily Dickinson's free verse poetry, naturalism, reflected by Emerson and Thoreau, and Gothicism, which was particularly featured by Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Transcendentalism came with its own focus on finding a deistic connection, which was called sublime. Of course, other writers of the day were focused on reform movements, which were helped by the rise of sentimentalism, for example, Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl, and psychological realism, for example, Herman Melville's Benito Cereno. These reform writings, of course, were intertwined with the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848, the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, and the Civil War in 1861. Mark Twain and Charles Chesnutt, after the Civil War, championed the regional and local color realism, and other noted realism writers were Henry James, Edith Wharton, and others. Finally, we have the modernism and postmodernism movements. Now, this period following the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, and getting into the World Wars, Cold War, and Civil Rights movement, all gave way to a movement called modernism, which put confidence in science and technology to reorder the social and natural world. Great authors featured here are Ernest Hemingway, See the Snows of Kilimanjaro, and Ezra Pound, whose poetry is a great example of the Imagism movement. Between the world wars, we got the Harlem Renaissance, where we got a flood of great literature and poetry from African Americans such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes. After modernism came postmodernism, which can be hard to define as its nature is to question everything. The skepticism and irony of postmodernism was well demonstrated by writers like Flannery O'Connor in Good Country People, Thomas Pynchon's Entropy, and Raymond Carver's Cathedral. And finally, in the late 1900s, we get a movement called multiculturalism, where the diverse cultures and heritages of the American people are given spotlight, such as Chicana literature from Sandra Cisneros and the Native American writings of Leslie Silko. Well, there it is, everyone, a brief coverage of the major movements that make up the arc of American literature. Thank you to Google Images for allowing me to use their images for this video. I hope you found it useful. Please leave a like if you liked it, and have a good one. Please keep reading.